Good evening, everybody, on Monday night of the week of Parashat Bo, uh, the bar mitzvah parsha of my grandfather, um, and of course, an epic parasha in which we experience the Exodus. And from Rabbi Avital Hachstein, we will get more insight into her overall approach, I think consistent with what we've seen the last 2 weeks, a kind of a thematic look at something that the parsha draws out a value that it raises and kind of queries for us, and one midrash to develop that idea, along with a kind of a programmatic comment about what midrash does and how we read it. Not particularly long, um, and we'll have some time for discussion if there is. I'll share my screen. On belonging and otherness in Parashat Bo. Parashat Bo 5777, again from the year in which her Divrei Torah were featured by Mechon Hadar 8 years ago. The 12th chapter of Shemot gives us a wide-angle view of the present, past, and future. At the climax of the story, we find the description of the final plague, the death of the firstborn. This is when Paro finally relents. This is a little nod to last week's essay on stubbornness. Paro as the kind of epitome of stubbornness, Bnei Israel, a different kind of, we played around with other words, alternatives to stubbornness, stuckness, and God as the ultimate persister. This is when Paro finally relents and the Exodus begins. The first section of the chapter contains God's instructions to Moshe and Aaron for the preparations that the people of Israel should make for their departure. It's nice to see an alternative. We often translate Bnei Yisrael more literally as the children of Israel. She prefers the translation people of Israel should make for their departure. The first Pesach, that's the first 13 psukim of chapter 12. The second section of the chapter is focused on the way this Pesach will be commemorated in the future. That should be verses 14 to 20. The third section portrays Moshe as commanding the elders about all of these preparations, right? So that which was instructed in the first sections, we get the actual record of Moshe relaying those commands, verses 21 to 29, followed by a description of the actual events in verses 30 and following. I'd like to focus on a select number of verses which describe the Exodus and a midrashic question which this passage raises. So here from chapter 12, a bracha asks about Bnei Yisrael potentially being also able to be read as Bonei Yisrael. I love that homiletical take. Absolutely, absolutely. We're all always, of course, the famous teaching of the sages that says Al tikrei banayich ela bonayich, read not your children, but rather your builders. So perhaps we can apply that in other places where children are seen and read builders. Nice. And of course has the additional resonance of the fact that we became a nation in a period of in which we were mandated as slaves to build vayiven arei miskenot leparo, and then not long after our freedom, we're charged to build a mishkan and then a house for God. So sort of the role of construction plays through first as slaves and then as freed people. Okay, so from chapter 12, verses 30 to 31. Vayakom Paro laila hu v'chol abada v'chol Mitzrayim. Paro arose in the night with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians. Bati tzaka gedola b'Mitzrayim. There was a loud cry in Egypt. Ki ein bayit asher ein sham meit. For there was no house where there was not someone dead. Vayikra Moshe ulaharon laila. Paro called out, summoned Moshe and Aaron in the night. Vayomer kumu tzu'u mitoch ami. Said, get up and get out from amongst my people. Gam atem, you also, gam b'nei Israel, and also the children of Israel. You and the Israelites with you is a fair translation. The gam in plain sense doesn't really mean in English we wouldn't say also you and also them. We would just say you and them. You and the children, you and the people here now, Israelites, you and the Israelites with you, go worship the Lord as you said. In the Tannaitic Midrash collection, Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author asks about inclusion of various groups of people in the events of the fateful night of the first Pesach, who participated in Yetziat Mitzrayim. Atem, ein li ela atem, gerim va'avadim minayin, Talmud lomar gam atem. When Paro says to Moshe and Aaron, you, atem, that means you, Moshe and Aaron. How do I know that, or maybe it refers, she'll delve into this in a moment, but maybe you means somehow all of Bnei Israel. How do I know that strangers and slaves were included? Because it says gam atem from this added word, which again, as we said in biblical Hebrew parlance, gam, the first gam, also you and also the Israelites, isn't superfluous. It's just stylistic. But when the rabbis read, they say, what does it mean? Also you and also the Israelites. The first also is superfluous. It must be coming to add something, and it's coming to add the slaves and the strangers, converts. You, again, this is the translation now. This only includes you, the children of Israel, who are being addressed by the verse. From where do we know that it also includes converts or strangers, gerim, and slaves? Since the verse says, also you gamatem. This short midrash presents a very careful, gentle, it's funny, gentle. I'm just jumping over to the Hebrew for a minute to see. I assume the Hebrew word there is adin. Adina. Yes, maybe better translated. It feels like a AI translation. Maybe better translated as subtle, careful, subtle, and sensitive reading of the verses. First, it focuses on the word you, as spoken by Paro. It seems that you refers to the people whom Paro summoned at the beginning of the verse, Moshe and Aaron. That's who Paro called. In the straightforward reading of the verse, it seems Paro uses this word in order to distinguish between Moshe and Aaron and the rest of the people, as if Paro is emphasizing, I don't want you alone to leave Egypt, but also the rest of the children of Israel, right? Just going back to the Pasuk for a moment. Paro called Moshe and Aaron and said, get up and go out from amongst my nation, you and the Israelites, you, Moshe and Aaron, the two people I'm addressing, and don't leave just the two of you, take the whole nation with you. However, the Midrash chooses to read this word as excluding a specific social group. You, now meaning, it's a little bit fuzzy now. We mean you. Do we now just mean you, Moshe and Aaron? Do we mean you, the children of Israel? And not slaves and converts or strangers. The Midrash then asks, since we know that you has a limited and specific referent, Israel, how do we know that not only the biological children of Israel, but all of the people, including converts or strangers, she keeps doing this as she notes in the footnote here, the word gerim has a double meaning of both converts and strangers, which will be discussed further on. So every time, she refers to gerim, she gives both of these options. How do we know that not only the biological children of Israel, but all of the people, including converts or strangers and slaves, went out? Now she gets, I think, we really get to see her kind of shining insight into what Midrash does and what's behind it. The question of from where do we know, right? That was literally the term minayin, from where do we know, which is a word that appears everywhere in rabbinic literature, reveals two assumptions. First, the fact that it is obvious to the Midrash that the slaves and converts / strangers did in fact leave Egypt with the rest of Israel, meaning they're taking it as a fact. They just want to know what's the source for this absolutely obvious, necessary piece of information. Second, it emphasizes the fact that if you were to read the verses without a midrashic eye, you wouldn't be able to see that fact in the text, right? How do we know means both I take this thing for granted, but I also acknowledge that the text doesn't indicate it to me, and therefore I need some additional scriptural hook in order to ground it in the text, even though I know it necessarily must be true. There's a significant gap between the general inclusive assumption in the Midrash, that Gerim and Avadim were included, and what the verses state explicitly. The question of the Midrash is then, given that it was not only you, now again we've moved to you meaning Israelites, not only you who left Egypt, but also the slaves and the converts or strangers, where can one ground that assumption in the text? Let's step into the Egypt that the Midrash imagines. In this Egypt, not only are the children of Israel slaves to Paro, but they have slaves of their own, right? That's probably the most shocking thing that jumps out when you read the Midrash when it says, not only you, but also the slaves. What do you mean? Everybody was slaves. The whole point of Yetziat Mitzrayim is that we're going free from being slaves. So the slaves is everyone. Who are the slaves? In this Egypt, not only are the children of Israel, so in this Egypt, not only are the children of Israel slaves to Paro, but they have slaves of their own. In this Egypt, not only are the children of Israel strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them, but there are converts, Gerim, people who have chosen to join their group, to be foreigners among them. The term for these converts, Gerim, can be understood in two ways. Either as actual religious converts, whatever that means, people who've decided to take on the faith of this emerging Israelite culture religion, or merely as strangers, foreigners who have chosen to join the people. We may not practice the same, we may not accept all your assumptions, but we want to live and be with you as part of you. Go where you go for the purposes of the Exodus. Um, either way, we understand this term. The fact that the Midrash believes that they exist forces us to see the people of Israel in Egypt in a way that we wouldn't readily see from the verses. Thus, according to the imagination in the Midrash, Israel is a people composed of many different groups with different types of relationships. And it is clear that according to the Midrash, these other groups of people joined Israel not only when they left, but even while they were still slaves. It's just I think what she's doing here and just excavating, reading closely the Midrash is really remarkable, just to pause and think about exactly what is the Egypt that this Midrash imagines. How does it change our perspectives to think about these oppressed slaves who also had slaves, these oppressed slaves who were a people that other people wanted to join? Just footnotes here. The term gam also in the verse is a term that the Midrash uses to anchor its suggestion that the you who are leaving Egypt also includes converts and slaves. Instead of saying you, the verse says also you, which clarifies that Israel left Egypt with someone else, someone also, the slaves and converts who had joined them. Time after time, the sages brazenly suggest we imagine the unthinkable. And here they are brazen enough to describe Israel and Egypt as a nation that is powerful enough to have its own slaves, converts, or others who choose to tie their destiny and join them as strangers. The question that the Midrash raises brings us to the point where we no longer think of the children of Israel, because she moves back and forth between these different translations, if this is her translation, as slaves who were oppressed and disdained, but rather as a group that people would want to join and cling to. The Israelites even have their own internal hierarchy, people who have status and those who serve them as slaves. And of course, just, how does it change the way we view it? Can it still be both? Can you be oppressed and also have slaves? Certainly seems in principle possible, but it feels like it pushes against so much of how we tell the story, so much of how the Torah tells the story, so much of how the other midrashim tell the story. So it's curious, and of course, in her singling out this midrash, we have a skewed perspective. If we put it against all the other midrashim or many of the other midrashim that describe the oppression and the suffering, it's hard to square with a people that others want to join, a people that own their own slaves. So it's something to think about. Bracha writes, having slaves is part of being oppressed. Yes, there's certainly a truth to that. The true freedom is knowing you don't need to enslave anyone else, in a sense. However, the almost unbelievable assumptions and questions that the Midrash raises can be read as trying to accomplish something beyond reading the texts. They often reflect a worldview, a viewpoint, a concern, a belief, or a hope. Curious to see all those words in Hebrew. Um, Tfisat olam, or an outlook on the world. Chashash, a concern. Emunah, a belief or a faith. O tikva, or a hope. It is our responsibility as readers and learners to not only understand the content of what the Midrash says, but what it speaks to more broadly, what it implies, right? So now she's moving us to another layer of Midrashic analysis to say, okay, we've understood textually, narrowly, how the Midrash is rereading the Pasuk. We've understood how it's, changing our view on what the world that the Israelites were living in might have looked like. Now let's go a step further. What's the broader message or outlook that this Midrash is presenting? The teaching that we have has one direct statement, but actually reveals an almost opposite worldview. On the one hand, it includes the converts, or strangers, and slaves as being part of the people. But on the other hand, it leaves them as adjuncts and somewhat separate. This teaching exhibits the midrashic hermeneutic of inclusion, but a careful reading yields that this is a teaching with a profound lesson about exclusion. Even though the teaching explains that the Israelites left Egypt with the converts, or strangers, and slaves, the way in which these different groups are included is not as being part of an undifferentiated whole, but rather they maintain their status as add-ons, as extras, as others. The converts or strangers and slaves are spoken about and thought about as additional, as also, and they are not part of the original core of you, right? Gam atem means atem v'gam, you and some others. So the you still doesn't include them, even though they've been added on, but they're added on as add-ons. They're adjuncts, but not part of the root or essence. They aren't really part of the core of Bnei Yisrael. Now, pausing here for a moment, I think it's just worth noting that this sort of keyword gam, and I don't know if the Midrash plays with it in other places in this parasha, not surprisingly, introduces other kinds of questions of who's included. Hold on. Here we don't have the gam, but this key question of who's going out in the Exodus comes up in chapter 10, at the very beginning of the parasha, verse 8, when Paro wants to send Moshe and Aaron. He says, okay, who's going? Moshe says, Binarenu v'zakenenu nelech, bevanenu vivnotenu, bitzonenu vivkarenu nelech, kichag Hashem lanu. We're all going across age, across gender, with our flocks, because we're observing a festival of the Lord, and apparently that necessitates the presence of everyone. And Paro rejects that. Lochein, lechuna givarim vivdu et Adonai. Send just the men to worship. If what worship is what you're after, you only need the men. Send them, and that's enough, and chases them out. So even though the term gam is not used here, which I mistakenly thought it somehow was, this sort of question of who's included in the Exodus is something which is preoccupying the text and is an important part of telling the story. Now, hopefully, I can find the gam that I am thinking of, which is, I didn't look for this ahead of time. Hold on. So first here, after that gam atem gam b'nei Yisrael that the pasuk quotes, we're also told gam tzonchem gam bekarchem kechu, right? Adding on all of this, and then quite strikingly, uveirachtem gam oti, which is an interesting, seems a little bit potentially superfluous here, and bless me too, even echoes Esav saying barcheni gam ani avi, don't you have a blessing for me also, my father? So this idea of kind of the gam keeps popping up and adding on, right? I'm letting all of you go to worship your God. You're going to engage in kind of a ritual of worshiping your God, but don't forget about also me. Couldn't have a stranger add on to the Exodus in a sense than kind of Paro, obviously not including himself in the Exodus, but in kind of the moment of religious expression. Now, somewhere here it is. Okay. And once we're told about the departure of the Israelites, 600,000 men aside from the children, V'gam erev rav ala itam, v'tzonu vakar kaved, mikne kaved ma'od. Moreover, or also, this erev rav, the mixed multitude, which has spawned lots and lots of midrashic imagination and consideration and discussion. And at the pshat level is a really interesting question. Who are these people? Are these Egyptians? Who is the mixed multitude who joined along with them, and how do they figure into the rest? So I think while she doesn't say this outright, the theme that she's picking up on is not a theme that's only brought out by this one midrash, but it is a preoccupation of the Parashah, which is who's included and who takes part. You could certainly imagine a telling of the story that just keeps saying Bnei Israel over and over again, but we are quite concerned with this question of who's included. And now she ends. If we want to live in a society that is aware of the injustices of exclusion, where there is a call to expand the boundaries and to live with plurality and multivocality, to live lives of inclusion and equality, then this midrash teaches us something foundational. It's not enough to expand or to include. We have an obligation to look at the way we go about including. How do we invite other people to join us? How we behave towards them when they do. Sometimes we'll find that the way we attempt to bring people in will actually be exclusionary, leaving those who have been invited in as additions rather than as core members. The Midrash invites us to examine our own behavior and attitudes. If inclusion is our goal, are we doing it in a way that truly achieves it? Of course, the first thing I think about in this is something Rabbi Linzer often talks about, a slight debate between him and Rabbanit Devora, if I remember right, about kind of the use of the term inclusion. I think if I remember right, he's more flexible about it and she's more strong about it. But in principle, they both agree that it's a complicated term because, yes, in society, we certainly start out or find ourselves in moments where not everybody's included. And we want to include the people that aren't included. But when we call it inclusion, we're naming it, but we're also in some way perpetuating it. And how do you move past that to all of usness, togetherness, whatever that is? I think sometimes you have to pass through a stage where you speak about us and them, but that's only a vehicle to trying to get to an us, which is us. And at the same time, I know that there's some critique that, is implicit here, or that I think is still worth saying, that sometimes we can go too far with an us that erases difference. And so that's, I think, part of the complicated balance that she's inviting us to consider in this midrash and in this parasha and in this foundational moment of becoming a nation. So happy to hear questions, comments, and thoughts. Racha, go for it.
Yeah, just mentioning a couple things I put in the chat. At the tail end of the first comment I made, where I was talking about B'nai Yisrael as being builders, I was noticing that it felt radical in that section because they were in a position of oppression. To call them builders at that point in time, it's like to seed the momentum. And also that it gives us hope in these challenging times. And then in terms of the question of what phrasing is used when Paro and Moshe talk about people going out, I thought it was interesting that Moshe uses the term our rather than the, not the people, the flocks, whatever it is. And that implies ownership and command over and connection to, rather than a haphazard gathering of people in flocks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're referring to um, Bivanenu, Bina'arenu, Vizakenenu, Bivanenu, Vivnotenu, all those news, which are the plural possessive suffixes and have that sense, exactly, kind of ownership, of an established feeling of community, which isn't to be taken for granted.
And also that we're not talking about them as add-ons, like Paro
Yes.
says gam. Oh yeah, you
Yeah.
can also take.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful.
That we see them as all as integral.
Yes. 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 Beautiful. Thank you. James.
In the first sentence, it says, V'kra Moshe Aaron Lila. Why doesn't it say Belila?
Hmm. Yeah. Hold on. Let's go there.
Sounds like he's calling them night.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. One moment. Yeah, Pasuk Lamed Aleph here. Vayikra Moshe ul Aharon Laila, as opposed to Balaila. I agree, it's strange. Take a quick moment just to see if anything pops right up. Um,
Well,
David?
it also starts the pasuk before Vayakam Paro Laila.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So there's something going on. James is
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I'm thinking about right, as opposed to Balaila's for sure common by Ashkem Abraham Baboker. All right, I'm gonna make a note, see what um almost my initial reading of it. Second. My initial reading of it is kind of like it's sudden. So it's like it's unplanned. So it's kind of he woke up. It was not like not even in the night. He woke up night. It was night. That there's a it's a kind of a the literary feel is of the kind of jarring, sudden, unexpected nature of it. And even calling them in the night, like he called out to them, no, it was night. No, that's my first take. See what other commentaries I have to say. But well noticed. I think it is relatively uncommon to not have that prepositional bet. Hey, Brecha's got a take. Yeah.
Yeah, just that sense of nightness that both he was feeling and that he probably felt in any encounter with Moshe and Aharon, which were oppositional to him. So that sense of being in this dark nightness in both of those experiences.
Mm-hmm. 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 Great. Yeah. All right, good. I'm sure the Hasidic masters and maybe some of the Pashtanim have something to say about it as well. Yeah. Maybe it'll appear in the Dresha. Who knows? David L. Yep.
I have a fundamental question. When Paro says, Kumu tzu mitoch ami, gam atem gam b'nei Yisrael. I think the pshat, or at least the way that I hear it, is you two guys and all b'nei Yisrael. So I don't know what is the hook. I don't know what is the textual problem that the Parshanim are trying to address.
Mm-hmm. Right. So my first thought is that it is why doesn't it just say again? You wouldn't say Atem gam b'nei Yisrael, but why wouldn't you just say Atem u b'nei Yisrael or Atem v'gam b'nei Yisrael? Why that gam before the Atem? Which
Well,
again,
if you would say it in English, you might say, "I want yous all out of here,
right,
both you and Bnei Yisrael."
right,
It doesn't. I mean, maybe the Hebrew does sound stilted. It doesn't. I don't know enough.
yeah, yeah. Vayoma kumetsu mitoch ami, Atem u b'nei Yisrael. Yeah, no, I think it's there. It's not what Rashi sometimes calls the Kra Omer Darsheni, a pasuk that says it
Yeah.
begs for. It's not one of those. It's not one of those. It's much more seems to be, either driven by the motivation to teach this teaching and looking for a hook, or maybe the gam structure, even though maybe it's less common, so it still warrants the curiosity. I think somebody I'm trying to remember if it is Rabbi Akiva. There is a Tana, I think, who it says darshan not just all the ets, but all the ets and all the gams.
Oh,
Um,
really?
so because so often gam could just be replaced with the. Um, yeah.
Right. But what's? I mean, two other quick thoughts.
Yeah.
One is that Paro seems to want to clarify that this is not only a struggle of elites, it's a national struggle also. And then when he goes through his list, Gam atem, gam b'nei Yisrael, l'chu yivdu, etc., gam tzomchem, gam bekarchem, he's going through the list of what their requirements were, and he's now indicating that it's a complete contract. And then he says, "Overachtem gamoti," and you should also bless me. He's in his concession, he's asking for something. And the point of thinking about them as having slaves, the North Africa, this may be wrong. Lance, you'll correct me if I'm totally wrong. There's this intersection of what I would call Mediterranean culture and African culture. And you see it really explicitly in Morocco, and I assume you see it in Egypt. I've never been there. And so when you think about social hierarchy, I think the idea that there were people lower on the pecking order, which we certainly see in these United States, I don't think it's such a foreign idea that, slaves might have slaves.
Great. Thank you. Back to James.
I think she was saying that the Midrash, the people writing the Midrash, knew that there was an error rather left with them, and they wanted to find a textual proof that they were leaving with them. Like it was almost the backwards. Not that they needed to find something in the pasuk to drush, but they had a fact that they knew about that they needed to find an asmakta. Is that the word?
Yeah. If that would be true if we are equating Gerim and Avadim with the Erev Rav, right? Meaning you're right that she says the Midrash takes as a fact that strangers / converts and slaves went out with them, and it wants to know how we know this. And either the fact is because it says it somewhere else in the Torah, that's what you're suggesting, in the Parashah, that's what you're suggesting. I think she might be saying they took it as a fact even though it didn't say it anywhere else. It was the Midrash just simply assumed that had to be the case in its worldview, which didn't have to be based on an explicit pasuk somewhere else. And maybe that Gerim and Avadim were even a different population than the Erev Rav. Could be.
And also, doesn't it mention that there was something I learned once. There's the commandment. Oh, I think Moshe commands Pharaoh and Bnei Israel that they were to release the slaves.
Let's see. I mean,
Not sure if it's in this.
Right. I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but back in Parashat Va'era, at the beginning it says, Vaytzaveim el bnei Yisrael ve'el Paro melech Mitzrayim lahotzi et bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Right. God that was charged Paro and bnei Yisrael to take bnei Yisrael out of Egypt. Right there, we were talking about that in the context of kind of bnei Yisrael's inability to believe that they were going to be freed, but it may be interpreted in other places also as indicative of their own slaves that needed to be freed. There is now that you say it, it does slightly ring a bell of of a midrashic tradition beyond this one, but I have to look it up a little more. Hold on a second. Hold on just a moment, folks. I'll be right. I'm back. Great. Other comments before we wrap up? We haven't heard from Lance. There we go. And okay, good.
I'd like to read something from AI Overview about Rabbi Hochstein. Rabbi Hochstein is known for co-authoring the book Women Out, Women In, The Place of Women in Midrash with Professor Chana Safrey, which examines the role of women in traditional Jewish midrashic texts analyzing how women are often excluded or interpreted in specific ways within these interpretations, essentially exploring the complexities of women's representation in Jewish religious literature. In other words, she is someone who is using, pardon my French, DEI. She is someone who is using terms from contemporary, and in a way, there's nothing wrong with that, except that she's projecting 21st century thought onto the Torah. And I think that's wrong. I mean, I think that you're essentially rewriting the Torah, which is great. I mean, I have no problem with that, but let's label it that way. Let's not say this is what the Torah says. Let's say this is what I see the Torah saying. Do you see what I'm saying? Am I or touched?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. I just don't know if that needs to be made explicit or if it's just understood that that's what we do most of the time. And you don't have to sort of say, I'm taking, contemporary terms like inclusivity and attempting, because I don't think, to me, it doesn't feel like the concept wasn't a concept that the Midrash was thinking about when it says, also the converts are strangers and slaves. But it's a narrower sense of inclusivity. But I think it's an interesting question. How much do we have to sort of name when we feel we're drawing on contemporary values or values that may be ancient, but we have contemporary terminology or contemporary ways of thinking about them that we're now bringing back to bear on the Torah? Kind of how explicit do we have to be about that? It's a fair question. Absolutely. All right. So thanks to everybody, and lots of gam to reflect on as we read the parasha and go through the week. Great rest of the week. Love to mom and dad. Good night to everybody. Bye.